All right, so last week we discussed a new topic, Hamiltonian cycle. So the problem of finding Hamiltonian cycle is NP hard. So last week we consider a simple sufficient condition that can guarantee the existence of a Hamiltonian cycle. So the sufficient condition we had last week is that the minimum degree of the graph is at least n over 2. Okay, so when the minimum degree is at least n over 2, well, this means there are lots of edges in the graph. So the graph is kind of dense. Okay, so yeah, intuitively, when you have lots of edges, you should be able to find a Hamiltonian cycle. So it turns out that yes, so when the minimum degree is at least n over 2, you can always find a Hamiltonian cycle. Okay. And the proof is actually an algorithm. Okay, so we consider an algorithm that always outputs a Hamiltonian cycle when the minimum degree is at least n over 2. Okay, so the algorithm, because today we're going to further extend this result and give you the second sufficient condition. So let's quickly review the proof and the algorithm. So the algorithm starts with maximal path. Okay, so given a graph, it's trivial to find a maximal path. So after you find a maximal path, you try to find a cycle that contains all the vertices on this maximal path. All right, so recall that a maximal path is a path such that you cannot further add more like edges or vertices to the path. Okay, for example, like this blue path. It is maximal, okay? It is not the longest path, but it is maximal in the sense that we cannot extend or add any more edges to its endpoints. So this is a maximal path. So after you find a maximal path, P, next we're going to find, a cycle, right? So there are two different approaches to find a cycle that contains all the vertices on a maximal path. So the simplest way is to we'll try to find an edge that connects the two endpoints. Then you get a cycle, right? And this cycle contains all the vertices. Now, the second idea is that when this V1 and Vk, so those two are the endpoints, when they are not adjacent, we can try to find two edges, not just one. We need two, okay? So these two crossing edges, right? So the property of these two edges is that, first of all, the two endpoints are V1 and Vk, okay? And these two edges, they cross each other in the sense that you can find two consecutive vertices on the path, like here V4 and V5, such that the left vertex is adjacent to Vk and the right vertex is adjacent to V1. Okay? Then you can just remove this edge, the edge between V4 and V5, and you get a cycle. Okay? So we call this crossing edges or crossing neighbors, right? So we're able to show that when the minimum degree is at least n over 2, this means there are lots of edges from V1 and going to these internal vertices of the path. Similarly, there are lots of edges that go inside this path, okay, from Vk, okay, because this is maximal. So all the neighbors of V1 must appear on the path. So similarly, all the neighbors of Vk must appear on the path. Otherwise, it will not be a maximal path. Right, so I won't go over the proof again, okay, but I only want to emphasize that actually we can have a slightly more general result. That is, in the proof, we assume that V1 and Vk, their degrees are at least n over 2. So actually, we don't need this strong condition. All we need is that their degree sum is n, okay? That is, it may be the case that V1 has a small degree, yet VK has a large degree. Then the proof will still work, right? So for example, if V1 only has 3 neighbors on the path, however, VK has lots of neighbors on the path, then we can still find these crossing neighbors, okay? 所以我们上礼拜有讲，就是整个证明的 idea 就是要去看 V1 跟 VK， 如果他们有很多个各自都有很多个 neighbor 在这个 path 上面，就会很容易找到这种就是横跨对方的那种 edge，OK？ 但事实上我们不需要 V1 跟 VK 同时都要有很大的 degree， 我可以让 V1 跟 VK 其中一个很小，一个很大也 OK， 为什么？因为我们那个时候的 idea， 如果我们稍微很快改一下的话。Okay, so I'll just use D1 and DK to denote the degrees of V1 and VK, okay? So last week we assumed that D1 and DK are at least n over 2. Today we're going to relax this condition and assume that their degree sum is at least n, okay? And the same idea still applies, okay? So this n over 2 becomes D1, okay? So V1 has at least D1 neighbors in this red box, okay? So this, we just exclude V2, so this becomes D1 minus 1, okay? So basically, just replace n over 2 with D1, and you get the result. Now, let's consider the green box. So this, once again, becomes D1, okay? Because for all these vertices, if it is adjacent to V1, then its left neighbor cannot be adjacent to VK, according to our proof by contradiction. So this is D1, and this is D2 minus 1, okay? So you get 2 sets, or 2 subsets, 2 disjoint subsets of the green set. One has a size of D2 minus 1, the other one has a size of D1 minus 1. So you still get D1 plus D2 minus 2. Now, we've assumed that the degree sum is at least n, so this is just n minus 2. So the same result, okay? So I think the upshot of this slide is to tell you that when the 2 endpoints have a degree sum of at least n, then you can find a cycle that contains all the vertices on a path, okay? All right, so next we will try to utilize this result to give you a stronger sufficient condition. Okay. So in this claim, we consider two verses that are not adjacent. So there's no edge between these two verses U and V. Okay. So this claim says, well, further we assume that the degree sum is at least n. Okay. So the claim says if you add the edge between this U and V, which are not adjacent in the original graph, but now you add one edge between them. Okay. So if this new bigger graph has a Hamiltonian cycle, then the original graph also has a Hamiltonian cycle. Okay? So you start with the original graph, and you want to know whether this graph has a Hamiltonian cycle or not. So it's difficult to tell. So this claim says, well, how about you add one edge between these two spatial vertices, which are not adjacent, and the degree sum is at least n, and see if you can tell whether this new graph has a Hamiltonian cycle or not. Okay. So this is the claim. Okay. So there are, I think, two questions about this claim. So first is, well, the correctness. Okay. So why is this claim correct? And the second question is, why is this even useful? Why do we need this claim? Right? Because if we do not know whether the original graph has a Hamiltonian cycle or not, then how can we possibly know a bigger graph has a Hamiltonian cycle or not? Right? Because it seems like if you have a larger graph, then it's more difficult to see whether there's a Hamiltonian cycle or not. Right? So next time I'm going to answer these two questions. Okay, so let's start with the correctness. Okay. The proof is quite easy. Okay. Okay. So because in this claim, the assumption is that the new graph has a Hamiltonian cycle. So let's just use this new graph, which has a Hamiltonian cycle, and we use this Hamiltonian cycle to build a Hamiltonian cycle for the original graph. Okay. 现在就是有两个图 ，OK， 有一个是原本的，有一个是加了一个边之后的 ，OK。然后这 claim 说，如果这个比较大的图有加了一个边之后的图，有 Hamiltonian cycle， 那我们就要去说明，那本来的也会有。所以我们要为了去建这个本来的 graph 的 Hamiltonian cycle， 我们就背上这个新的 graph 上面的 Hamiltonian cycle， 然后试着从这个新的 graph 上面的 Hamiltonian cycle 去建一个有本来的 graph 的 Hamiltonian cycle。So there are two cases, okay? Case one is when C does not use UV, okay? So that is in this larger graph, and so even on this larger graph, the Hamiltonian cycle does not use UV. So now how to find or how to create a Hamiltonian cycle for the original graph? So 我们现在有一个新的图的 Hamiltonian cycle， 然后这个新的图，它的差别就是，它加了这个 HUV，OK， 所以我现在第一个 case 是很简单的 case， 就是如果这个 Hamiltonian cycle 没有用到这个新的边，那原本的 graph， 哇，怎么说明它一定也会有 Hamiltonian cycle？如果你现在不知道答案，那只有一个可能性，就是我没有把这个问题讲得很清楚，因为这是很简单的 case。OK， 同意吗？所以你也知道为什么 ？OK， 所以原因是，它本来就没有用到，所以它删掉有没有都没差。所以那本来的 graph 的 Hamiltonian cycle 是哪一？ 所以换句话说，本来的 graph 的 Hamiltonian cycle 就是 C 嘛 ？OK， 对。Okay, so next case 2. So case 2 is when this Hamiltonian cycle C uses the new edge. Okay. Well, so this time we cannot just use this cycle C. We have to modify this cycle. Okay. So we have no choice but to remove this UV, right? Okay, so we start from a Hamiltonian cycle, remove an edge, so we get a path. So actually this path is not just a maximal path, okay? So it is what we call this Hamiltonian path. So a Hamiltonian path is a path that visits every vertex in a graph. But anyway, in this proof, we only need, let's call it Hamiltonian path. Or if you want, you can just write a maximal path, P, that contains all the vertices on the graph. Okay. So now we have a maximal path. So how to build a Hamiltonian cycle based on this path? So this P looks like this. So this time I'll write V1, V2 up to Vn. Okay, so this means all the vertices on the graph are on the path. Okay. So how to find a Hamiltonian cycle based on this path? And so far we haven't used this assumption. Right? So first of all, U and V, they are not adjacent, so you cannot find an edge between V1 and Vn. That's impossible. However, we have this assumption. That is, the degree sum is at least n. So how to use this assumption to get a Hamiltonian cycle? Well, this slide just shows you that when the two endpoints of a maximal path have a degree sum at least n, then you can find crossing edges. And you can use these crossing edges to build a Hamiltonian cycle. Okay? So because D1, du and dv, so this is u, and this is v. Right? Because we break this cycle by removing the edge between u and v. So these two endpoints will be u and v, okay? And their degree sum is large, okay? Is at least n. So we can find a pair of crossing edges. Okay? And we can use these crossing edges to build the Hamiltonian cycle. Okay. So this symbol is there exists, okay? So there exists crossing edges, therefore there exists a Hamiltonian cycle. You mean this one? Yeah, but the reason that we can have the initial cycle C is due to this assumption. But then if you do not have this assumption, you do not have this path. Right? The reason we have this path is because we remove an edge from the Hamiltonian cycle. So we have to start with a Hamiltonian cycle. The key step is to build a maximal path with endpoints U and V, and all the vertices on the graph appear on the path. Right, so, but how do you get this path without the Hamiltonian cycle? Well, the algorithm I had is that if you have a maximal path, then you have a cycle that contains all the vertices on the path. But in order to have a Hamiltonian cycle, in this case, the maximal path has to contain all the vertices on the graph, right? So yeah, we don't know how to do this, to find a path that contains all the vertices on the graph. So in the previous algorithm, we will keep finding larger and larger cycles. So if the cycle is not Hamiltonian cycle, we can always find a larger cycle, a longer maximal path. So we can just repeat the process until we find a Hamiltonian cycle. But in this proof, okay. So notice that I do not assume that for any two non-adjacent vertices. No, I only consider two specific vertices. Yeah. OK， 所以，这也是一个蛮不错的讨论，就是说，我们前面这个演算法事实上是它会不断的去执行，它会先从一个 maximal path， 这个 maximal path 就跟刚后面那个 Hamiltonian path 就不一定会一样，这个 maximal path 它不一定要 cover 所有的 vertices， 像这里，这个也是一个 maximal path， 它明显没有包含所有的没有包含所有的点。那我们做的事情是找到一个 maximal path， 我就会找到一个 cycle 可以包含所有上面的点。那这个 cycle 有可能不是 Hamiltonian cycle， 那如果不是的话，稍微回忆一下，我们有说，它就一定会找到没有被它包含的点，然后找到一个 path 点起来，因为这 graph 必须一定会是 connected， 如果 minimum degree 是 n/2， 所以你就可以找到一个更长的 maximum path， 然后你就可以继续找到一个更大的 cycle。OK。当然，在这边呢，我们刚刚的 proof 一开始就假设这个 path 就基本上是最长，它不需要再去进一步延伸。OK， 那我们之所以可以有这个假设，是因为我们假设那个更大的图有一个 Hamiltonian path， 有一个 Hamiltonian cycle， 所以我就可以很容易找到一个 Hamiltonian path。有吧？还没有问题。Okay, so I think this solves the problem or the question regarding the correctness. Okay. But still, we don't know how to use this claim, right? So next, I'm going to discuss the application. So why is this claim useful? So I'll give you an example. Okay, so my question is, does this graph have a Hamiltonian cycle? Well, not very easy to tell, right? Okay. So next, we're going to apply this claim. Okay. So to apply this claim, we have to find two non-adjacent vertices such that the degree sum is at least n, and then we can add one edge between these two vertices. Okay. Okay, so in this case, n is 6. Okay, so we can connect any two vertices as long as their degree sum is at least 6. Okay, so for example, we can connect C and D. Okay, why? Because C and D are not adjacent, and their degree sum is 6. So does this graph have a Hamiltonian cycle? Well, again, if you still think it's difficult, we can just keep adding edges. Okay. So next, we can add an edge between these two, okay, B and D. Okay, because degree of B is 3 and degree of D is 4. Okay, and we can then add an edge between B and E. Okay, so degree 2, degree 4, so we can add an edge. Okay, and degree 3, so we can add an edge. And degree 2, degree 4, so we can add an edge. Degree 4, degree 3, so we can add an edge. Okay, so from this moment, you know that you can actually add any edge to the graph. So actually, this graph will become a complete graph. So can we find a Hamiltonian cycle in a complete graph? Yes, right? Trivial. So now we know that the original graph has a Hamiltonian cycle because the final graph we obtain is a complete graph, which has a Hamiltonian cycle. Okay, so this is a complete graph. Therefore, the original graph has a Hamiltonian cycle. And actually, if you want, you can like reverse engineering this proof to get from the origin, from the larger Hamiltonian cycle to the original to a Hamiltonian cycle for the original graph. Okay, you just Well, for this case, you don't need to modify anything. For this case, you need to remove the new edge and find the crossing edges, okay? So actually, you can turn this proof into an algorithm, okay? Right. So this is the application, okay? Okay, so step 1, find U and V such that first, they are not adjacent, and second, the degree sum is at its n, okay? And we just add an edge, okay? And we repeat. Okay? And we check whether the graph is a complete graph or not. Okay. So this is an application of the claim. Okay. So we just keep adding edges, okay, until we cannot find such a pair of vertices. Okay. Then we stop and we check whether the graph has a Hamiltonian cycle or not. Okay. So especially when the graph becomes a complete graph, and you know that there's a Hamiltonian cycle. Okay, so there's a spatial name for this final graph, okay? So this is called the closure of G, okay? So G is the original graph. So this final graph is called the closure of G. And the notation is CLG, okay? Okay, so the next question that we're going to discuss is under what conditions will this closure of G be a complete graph? Okay, so now you have the original graph and want to do some simple check to see whether the closure of G will be a complete graph or not. Okay. And this will give us the second sufficient condition. Okay, so I'll use G prime to denote the closure of G. Okay. And for the second condition, we will consider not just the minimum degree, we will consider the degree sequence. Okay, so recall that like in the first week of this course, we discussed whether a given degree sequence is graphical or not. So today we're going to discuss whether a given degree sequence has a Hamiltonian cycle or not. Okay. So D1, D2 up to Dn are the degrees, and we assume that D1 is the smallest degree, and Dn is the largest degree. Okay, so this is our second sufficient condition. Okay, so this condition considers the degree sequence. Okay, so we will consider like the smaller degrees. Okay, because D1, D2 up to Dn over 2, these are like the smaller degrees in a graph. Okay, so there are two conditions we have to check. Okay, and we need to satisfy these two conditions for every like small degrees. So the first condition says this degree cannot be too small, okay? So this means D1 should be greater than 1, D2 should be greater than 2, D3 should be greater than 3, and so on, okay? So these smaller degrees cannot be too small. For example, D2 cannot be less than 2. Okay, or D3 cannot be less than 3, okay? Or, so if indeed this small degree is really small, there's still a chance that we can have a Hamiltonian cycle. So to compensate this small degree, we have to make sure that there's one vertex that has a large degree, okay? So this means Dm minus 1 is at least m minus 1. So this is like the second largest degree. So the second largest degree should be very large. So it should be at least n minus 1. So again, the third largest degree should be, again, very large. It should be at least n minus 2, okay? So for every small degree, you have to make sure that the degree cannot be too small, or you have to make sure that there is one vertex that has a large degree. So in this case, you can have a complete graph as your closure, okay? OK， 所以这个 claim 可能稍微复杂一些，所以不知道大家有没有问题。所以基本上我们需要检查所有的比较小的 degree， 就是前半段 ，OK，D1 就最小 ，D2 第二小，第三小，一直到第2分针 ，OK。那我们在检查这些 degree 的时候，我们要确保说，要么这个它的第 I 小的 degree 不能太小，不能小于 I，OK， 那不然就是有点像是你就可以找到另外一个 vertex， 就是 Dn 减 I 的，它可以有很大的 degree，OK，所以这个 Di 你可以把它想成 Di 小，然后这个 Dn 减 I 有点像是 Di 大 ，OK， 但不完全正确，因为 Di 大，第一大的应该是 Dn 了 ，OK， 所以这边差不多的意思，所以这个 Di 小，这个 Di 大。所以要么我不能确保我要确定说这个 Di 小的不能太小，或者这个 Di 大的要很大，有点像是这种感觉。OK， So we're going to prove this by contrapositive. That is, to show if P then Q, we can show if not Q, then not P. Okay. So this is P, and this is Q. Okay. So we have to find the negation of P and Q. Okay. So the negation of Q is easy. Okay. So the negation would be G prime is not a complete graph. Okay. So what is the negation of P? So if I tell you that this is wrong, then what is the result, or what is the implication? 所以我们等下就会，就是我刚刚说了，中文我们不确定什么，就是有一个若 P 则 Q， 你就可以去证非 Q 则非 P 这样子 ，OK？ 所以我们就要，这是我们的 P， 这是我们的 Q， 所以我们要先搞清楚这个 P， 它的 negation 就非 P 会是什么意思？这个我猜离散数学应该有学过 ，OK？ 特别是因为这边有 for，OK？ 然后这边有 or， 所以这个 negation 会是什么？ OK， 所以这个 negation 是，没关系。for each 变成 for some， 是这样吗 ？OK。通常我们不会写就是存在了。OK， 就本来是对于所有，那现在就变成存在。OK。那存在什么东西？存在 i 大于 n。OK， 所以逻辑上是这样，你还是会考虑一样的那些点，一样的那些 set， 那个 set， 只是那个 set 它本来会满足的性质，现在会有一个至少一个会不满足，所以不满足这个就代表小于会变成，当然是大于，所以会变小于等于，然后这个是小于，然后这个 or 会变成 and。OK， 所以本来是说，这个成立或者这个成立，但如果这个是错的，那就代表这两个都不成立。OK， 都不成立，所以这里有 and。Alright, so this is the claim we will prove. Okay, and yeah, so this claim and the previous one they are equivalent. So 有问题吗？ And I want to stress that these degrees are based on the original graph. All right? Because for this one, we actually consider the original degree sequence, okay? Okay, so next I claim that to prove this, okay, you only need to prove this, okay? That is, we consider the degrees on the closure, not the original graph. So if we can prove this, then we have the previous claim. Okay. So the only difference is that now I consider the degrees on the closure, not the original graph. 这里就不是，这里不是非 P， 就这不是那个关系。对。OK， 没关系，我们先休息一下，大家可以想一下。OK。 Oh, okay. All right, let's continue. So here we have two claims. The only difference that here we consider the degrees on G prime, and in the previous claim we consider the degrees on the original graph G. Okay. So which graph, G or G prime, has a larger degrees sequence, or which one has like more edges, G prime or G? So to get this G prime, so recall that G prime is the closure of the original graph, and to obtain this closure, we keep adding edges, okay? Keep adding edges to non-adjacent vertices with degree sum at least n. But anyway, G prime has more edges than G, okay? So if we have this final claim, which says that we can find some small degrees, okay? So these degrees are less than I or less than m minus I in this dense graph, G prime, because it has more edges. Then clearly, if we consider the same vertex vi and vm minus I, then in the original graph, these two vertices must have fewer or at least the same number of degrees. Okay, so if this holds for this dense graph, then it also holds for the original sparse graph, which has fewer edges. Okay,所以我刚刚说的事情是，这个 closure 就是 G prime， 它得到的方法是在本来的 graph 一直加 h， 一直加 h， 所以一直加 h 就会让 degree 变大。OK， 所以如果你去考虑 G 跟 G prime 的话，这里 G prime 的 degree 一定会比之前的更大。那如果这些比较大的 degree 它都不会太大，它都不会超过 i， 也不会超过 n 减 i， 那很明显它在本来的 graph 它的 degree 也不会超过 i 跟超过 n 减 i。OK， 所以我们只需要去考虑这个比较严苛的条件，就是在最后的这个 closure 上面。所以我们等一下就会全部都只考虑一张图，就是 G prime， 我们就不会考虑original 的 graph。OK。我不知道这样有没有问题，知道我在说什么？所以我再整理一下 ，OK。我们现在要说的事情是，重新来一次 ，OK。这是我们今天要看的第二个 sufficient condition，OK。那它的 idea 就是要去看 closure 是不是 complete graph， 因为如果 closure 是 complete graph， 我们之前那个 claim 就会告诉我们，本来就会是 complete graph。所以我们这边要考虑的是一个这个 sufficient condition，OK， 所以只要在 original 的 graph 里面，它的 degree 不会太小，那 closure 就会是 complete graph。所以我们去证非 Q 则非 P， 所以非 Q 则非 P， 刚刚 negation 我们稍微考虑一下。那重点就是，如果我们去考虑非 Q 的话，就会变成是。你可以找到某一个，应该把它想成某一个 index i，OK， 然后这个 index i 呢，它有底下的条件，就是第 i 小的 degree， 它的 degree 不会超过 i， 然后第 n 减 i 小，会有点像第 i 大的，它的 degree 不会超过，它的 degree 会小于 n 减 i，OK， 所以直觉上来讲，这边都是告诉你说 degree 不会太小，degree 不会太大。所以，如果我们要说明它的 degree 不会太大，在本来的 graph 上面，其实你只需要去说明在新的 graph， 就 closure 那个加了一堆 edge 进去之后那个 graph， 就连那个加一堆 edge 进去的 graph， 它的 degree 都不会太大。那这样子，当然在本来的 graph， 它的 degree 也不会太大。OK， 所以这是我们接下来要做的。Okay, so next I'll give you a different physical meaning of this equation or this inequality, that is di is at most I. So this means, so recall that di is the ith smallest degree in G prime, okay? So this implies that there are I vertices of degrees at most I, okay? And similarly, this is, there are m minus I vertices of degrees less than m minus I. Okay. Okay, so the intuition is that if you can find lots of vertices of small degrees, then this di cannot be too large. Okay, so similarly, if you can find m minus I vertices which have small degrees, then dm minus I cannot be too large. So in our proof, we will find these vertices. Okay, we're going to find a set of vertices with degree m minus I, and find this set of vertices of degree less than m minus I. Okay. Okay, now so we are now ready to prove the claim. Okay. Okay. So we're going to start from a graph that is not complete. Okay. And we try to find these two sets of vertices. Okay, so okay, so because the graph is not a complete graph, so there are some edges that are not on the graph. Okay, so this means we can find a pair of non-adjacent vertices. Okay. Okay. So the first point says we can find a pair of non-adjacent vertices, but there can be many such pairs. Okay. So we're going to choose the pair that has the largest degree sum. Okay. So there can be 2 or 3 pairs of vertices that are not adjacent. So among these non-adjacent vertices pair, we're going to choose the one that has the largest degree sum. Okay. So the reason that I call them S and L, well, because you can think of this S as smaller and this is larger. So this means we assume the degree of S is less than or equal to the degree of L. Okay. So S has a small degree and L has a large degree. Okay. So I claim that the degree sum is at most m minus 1. So can you see why? So here we consider the degrees on the closure, okay, not the original graph. So this says on the closure, the degree sum of S and L is at most m minus 1. Right, right. So the reason is that if the degree sum is at least n, then we can actually add an edge. Okay, so this means the closure we have is not the closure because we can still add edges. Okay. So we have this ds is less than n over 2. Okay. Right, because the degree sum is less than or equal to n minus 1, and s is the smaller one between these two, so it is at less than n over 2. Okay. Now, recall that we also have to find this I. Okay. So I is a number less than n over 2. So since we've shown that ds is less than n over 2, we're going to just let I be ds. Okay? So I is just a smaller degree in this vertex pair. Okay? Okay? So this I, we now know that this is ds. Okay? So next we have to find these two sets, and we start from the first one. Okay? So we want to find this many vertices such that their degrees is at most I. Okay? Okay, so let me first draw a picture. So this is S and this is L. They are not adjacent. Okay? And this one has a large degree. And this has a smaller degree. Okay? So the first goal is to find a set of ds vertices. And their degrees are most ds. So can you see how to find this set of vertices? 所以我们现在已经确定，就是我们的 I 就是这个 S 的 degree，OK，S 有比较小的 degree，L 有比较大的 degree，那它们没有相邻。那我们现在要做的事情是，我们要找到一些 vertex， 这些 vertex 呢至少要有 ds 个，然后它们的 degree 不能太大。它们的 degree 最大就是 S 的 degree。所以有人看出来要怎么找吗？ So we're going to consider vertices that are not neighbors of L. That is, we're going to consider vertices that are not adjacent to L, okay? Excluding L. So we cannot consider L because L has a large degree, but for this set, the degree cannot be large, okay? So we cannot consider L. So basically just all the vertices that are not adjacent to L. Okay? And I claim that this is the set. So we have to prove two things. So the first one is the size, okay? So how many vertices are not adjacent to L? Well, this is just the number of vertices in the whole graph minus the number of neighbors of L, or the degree of L, minus 1 because we cannot consider L. Okay? Okay? Now recall that we have this inequality. Okay? So this says so just rearrange this term by moving DL to the right-hand side. We get this inequality, okay? Or this. Okay. So the size is at least I, okay? And the degree so I claim that these vertices, they can have, the degree is at most ds.来说，我整理一下 ，OK。所以目前有了就是有两个 S 跟 L， 然后它们没有相连 ，S degree 比较小 ，L degree 比较大。然后还有一个重点，就我刚刚说了，就是有可能有很多个这种没有相邻的 pair， 那我们会选那个 degree 上最大的那一个 ，OK。好，所以我们刚刚要找的第一个 set 就是我们要至少找到 I 个，也就是 ds 个 vertex， 然后这些点的 degree 不能太大，它的 degree 最大就是 s 的 degree，OK。所以我们刚刚已经有搞定这个 size，OK，所以这边没关系，这个 I 就是 ds。那现在的就是说，这些没有跟 L 相邻的这些点，它们的 degree 最大是多大？有没有可能它的 degree 有一个点它跟 L 没有相邻？比如说这叫 x， 结果 x 的 degree 比 s 更大，有没有可能？这个是没有相邻的哦。所以这个 x 是一个跟 L 没有相邻的点，那这个 x 的 degree 有没有可能比 s 更大？那我直接给答案，答案是不可能，因为它还违反某一个我们之前的假设。这个。就在所有没有相邻的 vertex 里面 ，vertex pair 里面 ，S 跟 L 它们的 degree sum 是最大的。所以如果这个 x 它的 degree 比 s 更大，那 L 跟 x 的 degree sum 就会 超过 L 跟 S。OK， 所以这个所有跟 L 不相邻的点，它的 degree 最大就是 ds。OK。可以接受吗？Okay. So we figure out the first set. So next, the second set. Okay. And the second set is constructed in a similar manner. Okay. So next, well, I think I can just copy paste. Okay. So for the second set, we have to find m minus I or n minus ds such that the degree is less than m minus ds. Okay. Okay, so how to find such a set? So for the previous set, we consider vertices that are not adjacent to L. Okay. So how about this case? So for this case, we're going to consider vertices that are not adjacent to S, including S. Okay? Because this m minus ds is a quite large degree, and S has a small degree, so S should not satisfy this inequality. Okay, but yeah, anyway, we just consider the vertices that are not adjacent to S, okay, including S. So again, we have two things to prove. First, the size, and second, the degrees. So what is the size? Well, it is just n minus the degree of S. Why? Because we basically exclude all the neighbors of S. So m minus ds, that's the size, okay? And what is the degree? Well, by a similar idea, the degree is at most dl, right? Because if you have a vertex here, and this is not adjacent to S, then the degree of y cannot be greater than L. Otherwise, you have a pair of non-adjacent vertices with a larger degree sum. So once again, we can use this inequality. So dl is sorry. Oh, and also this is degree less than m minus I, okay? So this is less than m minus ds. So this is equivalent to m minus ds minus 1, okay? Because degrees must be integers, okay? So can change this to this. So the result is that the degree of the verses in the set is at most m minus ds minus 1, which is the desired result. Okay, so that's a proof, okay? 所以这边我觉得整个 proof 稍微比较复杂的，反而是前面这个 claim 的转换 ，OK， 就是我们本来要正的，然后我们用类似若 P 则 Q， 那非 Q 则非 P， 所以做了一些转换，然后我们本来是看本来的 graph 的 degree， 但本来的 graph 跟最后的 graph 是有一点落差，所以这有点难处理，所以我们就干脆都考虑一样的 degree， 看得更严苛 ，OK， 最后这个 graph 如果它 degree 不会太大，那新的 graph degree 也不会太大。最后的 graph degree 不会太大，那本来的 graph degree 也不会太大。Sorry， 所以我们就是要去找到这个 I， 还要找到两个 set。然后，就关键其实就是要去看，我会说整个后面的关键就是这个 ，OK， 所以我们要去看在所有没有相邻的点当中，哪两个它们的 degree 的总和是最大的 ，OK， 把它挑出来之后，后面其实就很容易 ，OK， 所以不知道有没有问题，所以这个是第二个 sufficient condition， 所以这个第二个 sufficient condition 它其实就可以蛮容易去 check， 所以这个 condition 它只需要有 degree sequence 就可以了，所以它甚至不需要跟我讲说 edge 之间怎么连，它只需要告诉我 vertex 的 degree。所以我只要看 degree 就可以很简单检查它有没有 Hamiltonian cycle，OK？、Okay, so next, the third sufficient condition. Right, but for this third and the final sufficient condition, we need a new idea. Okay, so the previous two sufficient conditions are based on the idea of first finding a maximal path and find a cycle that contains the vertices on a path. So for the last sufficient condition, the high-level idea is to keep finding larger cycles, okay? And we don't need maximal path. We just keep finding cycles after cycles, okay? So whenever the cycle is not Hamiltonian cycle, we try to find a larger cycle. Okay? So the basic idea is that first, we want to find any cycle, okay? So find a cycle C, and it is easy to find a cycle C, okay? So given a graph, it should be easy to find, I mean, the algorithm is easy, okay, to check whether there's a cycle or not, okay? So after you find a cycle, we try to find a larger cycle. Okay, so this is the cycle you have. Now, one simple way to find a larger cycle is to find two vertices that are adjacent and there's a path outside this cycle, okay, and connects these two vertices, U1 and U2. So clearly, if you have this path, then you can find a larger cycle. Okay. So given a cycle, how to find such a pair of vertices? Such that, first of all, these two vertices are adjacent, and there's a path that connects these two vertices without using any edges or vertices on the cycle. So how to find such a pair of vertices? 所以这一个很简单去把 cycle 变大的方法，就是你找到这 cycle 上面两个相邻的点 ，OK。然后如果这两个相邻的点，它们可以在这个 cycle 外部找到一个 path 把它们连起来，那很明显就可以找到一个更大的 cycle。所以现在的问题是给你一个 cycle， 你要怎么找到这样的 U1 跟 U2？有任何想法吗？对，我特别问大家，不是因为这个很难，是这个没有很难。OK， 这个还蛮简单的，所以我才问大家。可要怎么往外延伸，让它确保可以回来 U1？U1、U2 一起 BFS。是也 OK， 了解，就是等于是从 U1 出发，看一下它可以经过哪一些点；从 U2 出发，看它可以经过哪一些点。如果有交集，就代表它们有一个 path。这也 OK， 这也是一个确实是一个方法。OK， 那我在我讲我的方法之前，我不知道有没有其他做法。
如果 degree U1 跟 U2 加起来大于等于2的话，它们就一定有一个 cycle， 就已经老了。
也没错，不过这个 condition 就有点太强，我们接下来要看的 condition 就不想要那么强，不想要看到 degree， 所以第二个接下来要看的这 condition 它不会看 degree， 它会看其他东西。不过你说的是对，就如果确实 D1 跟 degree 它们的 degree sum 是超过 n， 那它们就会有 common neighbor。OK， 所以我这边会做的事情就是第一步跟刚陈同学说就是一样，就是简单说把这个 cycle 直接移掉，移掉之后你就会很多个 component， 然后看一下这两个点有没有跟某一个 component 是相邻。只要它们相邻，那就代表它们有一个 path，OK， 所以示意图比较像是这样子。Okay, so just first remove the cycles from the graph and you get some components and check whether this U1 and U2, they are adjacent to the same component. So if they are adjacent to the same component, like in this case, H1, then there's a path, okay? So this is like a very easy idea to find a larger cycle, okay? So to find a larger cycle, first we focus on two adjacent vertices or two consecutive vertices on a cycle. So the second idea so step 1, step 2, and step 3, okay? So the next idea is to, well, first, we can still remove the cycle to obtain some component H, okay? So we already know that if two consecutive vertices are adjacent to this component, then we can get a larger cycle, okay? So we will not consider this idea. We're going to consider the case where these two vertices, so they are not consecutive on a cycle, but yet they are adjacent to H, okay? So we want to find a way to find a larger cycle, okay? And this larger cycle should contain all the vertices on the cycle and some vertex in the component H. So clearly you have to add at least one more edge, okay? Because if you do not have any more edges, you cannot contain all the vertices on the cycle and some vertex in H. So you have to add at least one edge. So the question is, which edge should you add so that you can have a cycle that contains the original cycle and some vertex in the component H? Okay. So there are 9 vertices on the cycle plus some vertex in H, okay? That is the cycle that I want, okay? So I want to contain at least 10 vertices. But I need to add at least one edge. AC, right. Okay, so if I have this HAC, then there's a larger cycle. Okay, so this is the larger cycle, which contains all the vertices on the cycle, along with some vertices in H. Okay. So I think the key idea is to find this kind of edges, okay? So first we have to identify the property of this edge. So what is so special about this edge? Yeah, but when you talk about crossing edges, there are 2 edges, right? Yeah, but here we only have 1, okay? So I think the critical property about this edge is that first we identify 2 vertices that are adjacent to H, okay? That is U1 and U2. And then we find the clockwise neighbor of these 2 vertices, okay? So A is the clockwise neighbor of U1, and C is the clockwise neighbor of U2. 我们去看它有点像顺时针的邻居，所以如果这2个点它们都跟 H 相邻，然后它们的顺时针的邻居 S 是相邻的，中间有 H， 那事实上我们就可以找到一个更大的 cycle。Okay, so next I'm going to call this vertex. So U1 and U2, I'm going to call them the connectors. Right, in the sense that they somehow connect the cycle and the component, okay? And I'll call C and A the follower. So in this case, A is the follower of U1 and C is the follower of U2. Okay? So the key idea is to find two adjacent followers. Okay? So if you can find two adjacent followers, you can have a larger cycle. Okay? And when you have a larger cycle, you can just repeat the process. Okay? So go back to the step. So try to find U1 and U2. So this time U1 and U2, they are adjacent. And again, they are adjacent to the same component. So we can get a larger cycle. And then this step again. So again and again until we find a Hamiltonian cycle. So in this case, in this algorithm, we do not use any maximal path. Okay? All right, so let me first write down the formal description of the algorithm. So first step, find a cycle. Let's call this cycle C. And the second step is basically this step, but we're going to keep finding this pair of U1 and U2. That is, as long as they are U1 and U2 that satisfy this property, we're going to enlarge the cycle using U1 and U2. Okay? So we may apply this idea several times before we go into the next step. Okay? So keep enlarging the cycle until no two consecutive vertices are adjacent to the same component of G minus C. Okay? So recall that the way we find U1 and U2 is by removing C from the graph and we get some component. Okay? So whenever there's some component such that these two consecutive vertices are adjacent to it, then we can find a larger cycle. Okay? So we just keep using this idea to find larger cycles. So we stop when we cannot find such a pair of vertices. Okay? Okay, so let's step 2. And step 3, we find a component of G minus C. Okay? And let's call this component H. Okay? And then we use this idea. Okay? So we find all the connectors. Okay? And assume that there are K connectors. Okay? And find all the followers. Let's call them F1, F2, up to Fk. Okay? Okay, step 6. If 2 followers are adjacent, then we can find a larger cycle. And step 7, we just go to step 2. Okay, so this is the algorithm. And clearly, we should stop whenever the cycle is a Hamiltonian cycle. Okay, so yeah, stop. When okay. Okay, so this is the algorithm. OK，所以有问题吗？这我们等一下会分析，就是什么样的情况下这个演算法它一定会找到 Hamiltonian cycle。如果没问题的话，我们就先休息。
第二步就是 second sufficient condition。
OK，看有没有。
我们不是已经有这个？我们不是有这个吗？这个
对，
这个 claim。
对。
那如果有这个 claim 的话，我们为什么还需要走这一步？因为
OK，
我们不是已经假设，就我们今天想要证明的是这个嘛，就是只要等一下，我们想要证明的是。哦，等一下，这是什么条件？想想。
我不知道你还在想吗？还是
我在思考。
哦，好。
这一个，就如果只要证明这个，就如果最后的 final graph 是 complete， 那 original has Hamiltonian cycle， 那用
这个前面就可以了。
对，前面就可以了。
对，没错。
这边的话是在讲。
这个它等于是说，如果你要用前面，你可以从演算法的角度来看，就是如果给你一个 graph， 你的演算法是要判断它有没有 Hamiltonian cycle，OK，那你的演算法当然可以用这个 claim，那这个 claim 它就会变成是你必须要不断的去检查non-adjacent的 pair， 然后加 h 一直做，它可能会蛮复杂的。那这个演算法就很简单，它就只需要去 check degree 就可以了，对。对，所以这个本质上是不太一样，对，但是这个 condition 要真的有用的前提就是这个，因为它还是用到这个性质，对。
就变成说我确认它是 complete graph 的基本条件是不一样。
有点像是这样，就前面这个它为了要检查是最后是 complete graph，它真的要去把那个图建出来。 但这个就不需要，这个他看一开始的那个 to 的 degree 就可以知道它最后会不会是 complete graph。对，对。 Okay, so let's continue. Okay, before we prove that the algorithm can always output a Hamiltonian cycle under a certain condition, let's first review the algorithm. Okay, see which step is easy, which step is always doable. So first step, find a cycle. So this is easy. Okay. Okay, but I want to stress that not all graphs have a cycle. So we still have to identify the condition that can guarantee the existence of a cycle. Okay, so, but anyway, this part should be easy. Okay, and step 2 to step 5, well, we can always do these steps. Okay. So the only question is step 6, okay? So we want to find 2 adjacent followers, okay? So we want to know under what conditions can we have adjacent followers, okay? Okay. And recall that the definition of a follower is the clockwise neighbor of a connector. And a connector is a vertex on a cycle which is adjacent to some component H that we find in step 3. Okay? So we first have the component, and then we find all the followers and connectors. Okay, so to find adjacent followers, it's like you're given a set and you want to know when this set has an edge. Okay. So to find these adjacent followers, we will consider independent set. So recall what is an independent set. So an independent set is, first of all, it is a set of vertices, okay, such that these vertices are not adjacent. Okay. Okay. So why do we need to consider independent set for this problem? Well, the idea is the following, okay? Say the maximum, that is the largest independent set, okay? So assume that we have a maximum independent set of 5 vertices. And if a set has 6 vertices, then I claim that at least 2 of them are adjacent. So can you see why? 所以假设我们这边知道说这 graph 最大的 independent set 是有5个 vertex， 然后我们现在有一个 vertex， 它有6个 vertex， 有一个 set 它有6个 vertex， 然后我说这6个 vertex 里面一定至少会有2个会是相邻，所以换句话说就是这个 set 里面会有 edge。所以看得出来为什么吗？应该蛮直觉的嘛，因为如果这6个 vertex 它们都没有 edge 相邻，那这6个 vertex 就会变成一个 independent set， 那这个大小就会超过5。可是这就有矛盾，因为我们刚刚说最大 independent set 大小是5， OK， 所以我基本上我们就用这个 idea。OK， so the key idea is that, and also I will introduce this notation alpha g. So alpha g is the size of the maximum independent set. Okay. So the key idea is that if alpha g is less than k, so recall that k is the number of followers. Okay. Okay. So if the maximum independent set has a size less than k, then we know that these followers cannot be an independent set, which implies that two followers must be adjacent. Okay. So this is the high level idea. But now we have the second question, that is, what is k? Okay. We cannot know what is the number of followers. Okay. So next we're going to build a lower bound for this number of followers. Okay. And to introduce this lower bound, I need to introduce a new notion or actually a quite important idea in graph theory. Okay? That is the connectivity. Okay. So the connectivity of G is like how many vertices you need to remove to disconnect the graph. Okay. So formally, the definition is because there are different ways to disconnect the graph, we want to find the most efficient way. By most efficient, I mean the fewest vertices that you need to remove. So the definition is the minimum size of a vertex set. Let's call it set S, such that G minus S is disconnected. Or has only one vertex. Okay. Okay. So intuitively, if the connectivity is high, this means this graph is like strong, okay? Because it is not easy to break the graph, because you need to remove lots of vertices to disconnect the graph. On the other hand, if the connectivity is low, this means the graph is relatively weak, because you only need to remove a few vertices to disconnect the graph. Okay. So some example. And before I give you the example, we will use kappa G to denote the connectivity. Okay. So first, let's consider a cycle, okay? So what is the connectivity of a cycle? That is, given a cycle, how many vertices you need to remove from the cycle in order to disconnect it, to disconnect the cycle. Okay, so this is a cycle. If you only remove one vertex, then it is still connected. However, if you remove the second one and make sure that the second one is not adjacent to the first one, then you can disconnect the graph. Okay. So for cycle, the minimum number of vertices you need to remove is 2. And about a tree, and the number of vertices is at least 2. So there are at least 2 nodes in a tree. So what is the connectivity of a tree? 1, right? So basically, you can remove any internal vertex, okay? And you'll break the tree. How about a disconnected graph? So according to our definition, what is the smallest number of vertices you need to remove to disconnect the graph, if the graph is already disconnected? So you don't need to remove anything, right? So 0. Okay, so the connectivity of a disconnected graph is 0. Okay. How about a single vertex? So this is a graph that contains only one vertex. So this is the reason that in the definition, we have this kind of weird condition that is only one vertex remaining. This is for this kind of graphs. So when the graph has exactly one vertex, then you don't need to remove anything, okay? So yeah, the connectivity of this graph, okay? So this is a graph, and this one has kappa G being 0. Okay. Okay. So these are the definitions and some examples of kappa G, the connectivity of a graph. Okay. So are there any questions? Okay. Okay, so back to the previous question. So the previous question is to find the lower bound of the number of followers, okay? And we just introduced the idea of connectivity. So it should be not too surprising to see that kappa G is actually a lower bound. Okay, so on the left is the connectivity, on the right is the number of followers. Okay, and so the proof is quite easy. So we only need to show that Well, first recall that k is not only the number of followers. K is also the number of connectors. Okay, and connectors that connect the cycle and the component. So if you remove the connectors, you disconnect the cycle from the component. Okay, so after you remove U1, U2, you get two components. So this graph is disconnected. Okay, and yeah, so this is basically the idea. But we have to make sure that not all the vertices on the cycle are connectors. Because if all the vertices here on the cycle are connectors, and after you remove these connectors, you actually remove all the cycles. And you do not get a disconnected graph because all you have is one component edge. So we want to make sure that after you remove all the connectors, there are still some vertices remaining on the cycle. So then these remaining vertices on the cycle cannot be connected to the component. Therefore, you get a disconnected graph. Okay? So it's sufficient to show that some vertex on the cycle is not a connector. Okay? So because if we can show this, then this vertex, after we remove all the connectors, will be disconnected from the component H. Okay. 这步有点跳，我再解释一次 ，OK。所以这个左边我刚刚说的是 connectivity， 就是你至少需要移掉几个 ，OK。那我们现在说，这个会小于等于 k。那我们唯一需要做的事情就是找到一个方法，它移掉 k 个点之后，它会让这个 graph 变成 disconnected，OK。OK， 所以你就是找到这 k 个点，那这 k 个点会是谁呢？我们的目标就是要把 connector 移掉，把 connector 移掉，直觉上来讲 graph 那个 cycle 跟 component 就会被分开。OK， 这样比较不会跳 ，OK， 所以最一开始 idea 就是你要证明说，connectivity 不会太大，不会超过，比如说不会超过10啊。那你要做的事情就是找到一个方法，移掉10个点，它就会让 graph 变成 disconnected。因为这样子你就会知道最少你需要移的就不会超过10，有可能会比10小，但不会超过10。OK， 所以这边就是一样的 idea， 我们就是找到 k 个点，然后你把它移掉之后 ，graph 就会被分开了 ，OK， 所以这 k 个点我们刚刚就是说，就是直接会去看那个 k 个 connectors，OK， 直觉上来讲，它就是会连接 cycle 跟 component，OK， 只是我刚刚最后应该说一开始讲的是，我们必须要确保说这个 cycle 上面，会有一些其他的点，那这样子你把这个 connector 移掉之后，它才 可以跟这个 H 是分开的。如果上面的点全部都是 connector，那你把全部移掉之后，搞不好就只剩这个 H， 这样它还是一样是 connected， 所以就不是我们想要的。OK， 所以有人可以看得出来，为什么这个 cycle 上面除了 connector 之外，它一定会有一些其他的点。所以换句话说，我们的 cycle 不可能长这样子。OK， 这是我们的 cycle C， 这个是 H。所以如果我们的 cycle 长这样，就每一个点都跟 H 有相邻的话，那明显你把这上面的 connector 全部，这每一个都会是一个 connector， 因为它跟 H 相邻。你把它全部拿掉之后，这 graph 不会变成 disconnected， 因为它就剩一个 component。那我们要说明是我们的 cycle 不可能长这样子，不可能每一个点都跟 H 是相邻的。所以有人看得出来为什么？没错，所以关键是第二步就会继续找到一个更大的 cycle， 所以换句话说，如果这个是 connector， 那它的 follower 就一定不可能跟 H 相邻 ，OK？ Okay, so this is due to step 2. Okay, because in step 2 we're going to find 2 consecutive vertices, and in our notation it will be connector and follower. So if connector and follower they are both adjacent to the same component, then we actually can find a larger cycle. Okay. Okay, so when we execute step 4 or step 5, connector and follower cannot be both adjacent to H. In other words, follower cannot be connector. Okay. All right, so this is why the connectivity of a graph is a lower bound for the number of followers. Okay, 所以我们现在就有我们就有这个结论 ，OK， 那是 lower bound 跟这个 ，OK。So now I'm ready to introduce the third sufficient condition. So the condition is when alpha g is less than kappa g. Okay. So this is the size of the maximum independent set. And this is the connectivity. Okay. So when the size of the maximum independent set is less than the connectivity, then we know that this is at most the number of followers So we can find 2 adjacent followers. Okay, so we can find a larger cycle. Okay. So actually we can kind of find a stronger condition, okay? Okay, so the stronger condition is that we can allow equality here, okay? So when these 2 terms are the same, we can still find a independent, still can find a Hamiltonian cycle. Okay, so next I'm going to explain why, okay? Okay. So we will consider this set S. So S is the set of K followers and some vertex in H. Okay? So what is S? So S, in this case, let's call this X. So S is just A, C, and X. Okay? So we consider all the followers along with some vertex in H. Okay? And so the size is K plus 1, right? Because we have K followers plus 1 vertex, so the size is K plus 1. So K plus 1 is it is kappa G plus 1, okay? Because we've shown that kappa G is a lower bound of K, okay? So this implies that S has an edge, right? Because the size is greater than the size of the maximum independent set. Okay. So this is S, and we have some follower. And we also have some vertex from the component H. Okay? And there's an H within this set. Okay? And I claim that this H, so we know that there's an H here, but we also know that this H cannot be between a follower and H. 所以我们现在就知道，这个 set 有一个 H， 但是我想要说的是，这个 H 它的2个端点一定不可能是 follower 跟 H。所以如果是前面这张图的话， 我们就不可能有一个 edge 是连从 A 是一个 follower 连到这个 X， 所以可以看得出来为什么吗？为什么一定不能有这个 follower 到 X 那边？一样，所以又是跟刚刚是一样的 idea， 就是 step 2， 因为 step 2我们就已经确定说这个所有的 follower 都跟 H 是不会相邻的。OK。OK。Okay, so this edge must be between two followers. So once again, we shown that they are adjacent followers under this condition. Okay. Okay, one final question. Okay, so the last question is about the first cycle. Okay, so now we have make sure that in step 6 we can always find adjacent followers as long as we have the condition that alpha g is at most kappa g. How about step 1? Okay, so can we say that if alpha g is at most kappa g, then we can always find a cycle? OK， 所以第一步我们要找一个 cycle， 那我们要判断是什么样的情况可以让我们一定会找到一个 cycle。OK， 所以理想的状况就是我们刚刚说了，一样的 condition， 就是最大的 independent set 的大小不会超过 connectivity， 那这个时候就会有 cycle。理想上了 ，OK。我一直强调理想上就代表说事实上不一定 ，OK， 所以有一个 graph， 它这个 graph 很简单，然后这个 graph 它的 alpha g 会小于等于 kappa g， 就是最大的 independent set 会小于等于它的 connectivity，OK， 所以 independent set 不会太大 ，OK， 但是这个 graph 没有 cycle， 所以谁可以想出来这个 graph 会是什么？两个点连起来 ，OK。所以这个 graph， 它的 alpha g 会是1，因为所以在这边你最多只能选一个点 ，OK。然后它的 connectivity 是也是1，因为你至少需要移一个点才可以让这 graph 变成 disconnected 或者只剩一个点。所以它这个 graph 是有满足的 ，OK， 有满足这个限制，有满足这个不等式，但是呢，很明显它没有 cycle，OK， 那这个 graph 就是 K2，OK， 因为它也是一个 complete graph， 只是它只有2个点而已。所以那好消息，这是唯一的 counter example。OK， 只要 G 不是 K2。然后 G 又满足这个，那我们就一定可以找到一个 cycle。OK。OK， 所以快结束了，快结束了。最后这个暖身的问题，讲暖身好像会觉得这个 claim 很复杂，那这个 claim 也不很复杂，但是有一个更简单的 ，OK。 OK， 所以这是一个很简单的 claim， 就是这个 graph， 如果我告诉你说每一个点至少都有2个邻居 ，OK， 那我说，这个 graph 它一定会有一个 cycle。所以我之所以要考虑这个，是因为，等一下这边呢，如果我要去说它有 cycle， 其实我只需要去说明它的最小 degree 是2就可以了。OK， 那因为这个也蛮简单的。所以有谁可以看出来说，为什么最小的 degree 至少是2的话，这个 graph 就一定会有一个 cycle？ 每个点至少都有2个邻居，那我就一定可以找到一个 cycle。没有到非常直觉，对。有 n 条边。minimum degree 是2，没错。OK， 我 OK， 好。OK， 这也是一个不错的 proof。So recall that the total degree is twice the number of edges. Okay, so if the minimum degree is at least 2, then the total degree is at least 2n, which implies the number of edges is at least n. Okay. Now, if the graph has at least n edges, how to build a cycle? So n is the number of vertices. Okay. So say you have 10 vertices, then you have 10 edges. So how to find a cycle? 这应该也不会太难。
最短就是9个，如果是10个点的话，你全部连起来用9个嘛，你多一个点就10个点
但它不一定要是 connected graph。
那更简单，如果是 connected graph 的话，
不，它不一定是 connected graph。
那一样，那就代表你需要连就是少于8个，少于9个，假设8个，那你就一样8个，那现在还剩2条点，就10个点。
一样，我可以了解你的 idea， 但是再有没有更精准的？
如果我们随便从一个点出发，然后往下做就是 BFS， 然后全部要从这个所有的点之后，然后总共会走过 n 减1条边，因为呢你一个点出发，然后会有多出来的一条边一定是回缩边或者是cross edge， 对，你就可以找到一个。
嗯哼。一样，我觉得没有到超级清楚，但我也了解这个意思了。对。所以有没有其他的 argument 可以说明它一定会有 cycle？ 所以刚刚都是有一些简单的 idea， 但是有点比较难具体把它讲出来，或你可能会需要一些背景知识。OK。假设什么？啊哈？为什么？
就是小于这个减一，因为一个点和一个点之间只能有一条边，所以假设你没有cycle，那你最多边有减一。
OK， 应该是 OK， 了解。maybe 我重复讲，应该可能会是，如果这个 graph 没有 cycle， 那最多边的情况就是一个 tree。或者说，如果一个 graph 没有 cycle， 那它就是一定是一个 forest。那在所有的 forest 里面没有，最多边的情况就是 tree， 就是有 n 减一个。那当然它有 n 个，所以它就一定不是有 cycle。OK。但我不太想要写下来，因为我觉得我另外一个 proof 更简单一点。OK。所以有 OK。So my proof is based on again maximal path. Okay. So this is a maximal path P, and we all know that for the endpoints, their neighbors must be on a path. Okay. And since the degree is at least 2, we know that this one has one neighbor in this on its path. So this creates a cycle. OK. 所以就是 maximal path 的概念，就是两个 endpoint 所有的邻居都会在上面。如果 degree 至少是2的话，它就一定会有除了这个邻居之外，还会有另外一个邻居，所以连过来它就会有一个 cycle。OK。应该 OK 嘛 ？OK。事实上你还可以稍微更推广一下，如果这个 degree 越大，你可以确保这个 cycle 会越长。像这个 cycle 其实有3个点，那如果我再多一个 degree， 比如说 degree 是3的话，它这个 cycle 一定就会离得更远，所以这个 cycle 就会更大。OK， 所以基本上如果是 degree 是 k 的话，它的 length 就会是 k 加1。OK， 所以不止可以找到一个 cycle， 还可以找到一个很大的 cycle， 如果你的 degree 够大的话。OK， 所以我们最后要做的就是说 G 的 degree 至少是2。OK， 那我只剩3分钟，所以这个就留作业。OK， 所以大家最后一次作业就写这个，不会很困难。OK， 好，所以我们就差不多讲到这边，有问题吗？所以这一题就会是第2次作业的其中一部分。OK， 好，如果没有问题的话，我们就上到这里。